Queen Mary had once accepted the life the crown chose for her. She had been promised to one prince, mourned him before she ever became his wife, then walked toward his brother because the dynasty still needed a bride. No one had to call it cruel. The royal world rarely used such plain words when silk, sympathy, and duty could do the work more quietly. May of Teck learned early that a woman could lose choice and still be praised for standing beautifully. She learned that private desire was negotiable, but public usefulness was sacred. She learned that grief could be acknowledged for a season, then folded into the next arrangement if the crown required continuity. Decades later, her eldest son would stand before the same altar of duty and refuse to kneel. Edward would give up the throne for Wallace Simpson, and the public would hear a love story. Queen Mary would hear something colder. She would hear the rules that had consumed her life being challenged by the child who owed his future to them. Before she was Queen Mary, she was Princess May of Teck, born near the center of royalty but not safely inside it. Her family had blood, manners, invitations, and titles, but not the kind of money that makes refusal easy. That was the first lesson. Royal blood without security could become a beautiful trap. Her father, the Duke of Teck, had charm and rank, but not enough fortune to protect the family from embarrassment. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, was warm, grand, generous, and dangerous to any account book placed within reach. The Tecks were not poor in an ordinary sense. They had servants, jewels, connections, and a name that carried weight in drawing rooms. But in their world, shortage did not need to look like hunger to be humiliating. It could look like unpaid bills, borrowed favor, careful smiles, and relatives who helped just enough to remind everyone help had been needed. May grew up watching dignity performed under pressure. She saw how a family could be royal enough to be expected at important tables and still insecure enough to fear what happened if kindness stopped. That kind of childhood trains a girl to observe before she asks. She learned self-command not because she had no feeling, but because feeling could expose need, and need was dangerous. She learned to make composure look natural. She learned that the safest woman in a royal room was not always the prettiest, or the richest, or the most adored. It was the woman who understood what the room required and gave it without forcing anyone to name the cost. Long before the crown used her, May had been trained by embarrassment to make herself useful. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, the British royal family needed usefulness more than romance. Queen Victoria was aging, still powerful, still wrapped in memory and control. Her eldest son, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, had waited for the throne for decades while giving society enough gossip to keep every hostess alert. His eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, stood in the direct line after him. Eddie was gentle, socially uncertain, and surrounded by doubt. Some relatives thought him vague. Others thought him too weak for the burden that waited. History has often been unkind to him, but no one needs to invent darkness to understand the fear around him. The monarchy needed him married, steadied, and made respectable. It needed a wife who would not add danger to uncertainty. Queen Victoria looked toward May of Teck and saw the kind of solution dynasties trust. May had royal blood, Protestant credentials, a British upbringing, and no foreign political risk attached to her. She also had a quality that mattered more than anyone would have admitted aloud. She needed the match. A marriage to Eddie would rescue her future and lift the Tecks from the anxious edge of royal life into its center. Gratitude can become a leash When a woman has been taught that security is something powerful people grant and can withdraw. May was not only suitable, she was safe. She looked steady. She looked grateful. She looked like a woman who would understand that being chosen was not the same as being free. The engagement to Eddie was announced in December 1891. To the public, it looked like a happy royal development. To the family, it looked like stability. To May, it must have looked like the answer to a question that had followed her since childhood. What was she for? The answer seemed to be future queen. Once she was displayed in that role, she became more than a young woman engaged to a prince. She became an investment in continuity. Newspapers praised her dignity. Queen Victoria approved. The Prince and Princess of Wales accepted her. The machine began to move around her with dresses, letters, congratulations, and the quiet rearrangement of a private life into a public plan. Whether May loved Eddie deeply is not the strongest question. The stronger question is whether love mattered as much as suitability once the dynasty had placed its hopes upon her. Then the plan collapsed. In January 1892, Eddie became ill at Sandringham during the influenza pandemic. At first there must have been hope because families always try hope before fear is allowed to speak plainly. But illness moved faster than ceremony. On January 14th, Eddie died. He was 28. His death was a family grief, a national shock, and a dynastic crisis at once. For May, it created a position almost too lonely to name. She was widowed without ever having been married. She had no widow's rank, no widow's household, no widow's authority, but she had been seen by the country as his future. She had belonged publicly to a man who was now gone, and the same world that had praised her as a bride now watched her mourn as an almost wife. Royal grief has manners. It has clothes, letters, precedents, and witnesses. May had to be sorrowful without becoming inconvenient, devastated without losing control, loyal to the dead while still useful to the living. That was the royal art. One prince had died, but the dynasty could not die with him. Eddie's younger brother, Prince George, suddenly inherited the future. George had been a naval prince, not the central heir. He was blunt, shy beneath his firmness, disciplined and not naturally theatrical. He had lost his brother and gained his brother's burden. He also gained the problem of a bride. May remained exactly what the family needed: approved, tested, dignified, British, Protestant, and already emotionally tied to the succession. This is where the story becomes colder than a simple romance. May was not dragged from one brother to another. Royal families rarely need such crude gestures. The room was arranged around her until the acceptable answer began to feel like the only answer left. Condolence became expectation. Sympathy became pressure. George visited. The family watched. Queen Victoria considered. The Prince and Princess of Wales hoped. Everyone behaved beautifully, which is how many difficult things become possible in royal life. May could grieve, but she could not be allowed to vanish. A woman already approved for one future king was too useful to waste. The crown did not force May loudly. It taught her that refusal would carry costs no polite person needed to describe. George was not a villain in this arrangement. He was another person moved by the same machine. He had admired May while she was connected to Eddie. Now he had to imagine her as his own wife, not because a storybook had opened, but because death had changed the line of succession. He had inherited his brother's destiny and almost his brother's bride. If affection grew between them, it grew in soil crowded with graves, expectation and Queen Victoria's approval, May accepted George's proposal in 1893. Officially, she chose. But choice inside a royal family is rarely clean. It arrives wrapped in parents, monarchs, money, rank, fear, and the knowledge that some doors close forever once a woman says no. Their wedding took place in July 1893 at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. The public saw healing. The family saw relief. A dead heir had left a hole in the future. George filled the place. May filled the image. Together they made the monarchy look as if nothing essential had broken. That was the beginning of the marriage's sadness. It was not built on open cruelty. It was built on usefulness after loss. May did not walk toward George as a free young woman following desire. She walked as a suitable princess whose family needed security and whose dynasty needed steadiness. George did not receive a bride untouched by the past. He married the woman once promised to his dead brother while carrying the burden that brother's death had placed upon him. The marriage did not fail. That was the tragedy. It worked. It produced heirs, steadied the succession, avoided scandal, and gave Britain a royal couple that looked morally safe after the more glittering world of Bertie and Alexandra. Because it worked, almost no one asked what it had cost the woman inside it. Mary became proof that surrender could be rewarded if it was quiet enough, useful enough, and dressed in diamonds. She and George were loyal to each other. They built trust. They shared habits, duties, family worries, illness, ceremony, and the long labor of being watched. Yet trust is not the same as being known without armor. Their partnership became strong because both accepted limits. They did not ask each other for freedoms neither had been taught to want aloud. Within a year of the wedding, May gave birth to her first son, Edward, known in the family as David. The dynasty exhaled. A male heir secured the line beyond George, and May had fulfilled the first great requirement of royal marriage. More children followed. Albert, known as Bertie, then Mary, Henry, George, and John. The household they built valued discipline, order, duty, and emotional restraint. Love existed, but structure received the larger bedroom. Nurses and governesses did much of the daily work. Parents visited, inspected, corrected, approved, and withdrew. In their class, this was not considered cruelty. It was considered sensible. The upper ranks had a remarkable talent for outsourcing intimacy and calling it tradition. David, the eldest, grew into a charming and restless boy with a hunger for warmth that the household did not know how to feed. He wanted to be loved as himself before being measured as heir. That distinction was not encouraged. In a royal family, being yourself was acceptable only if yourself arrived properly dressed and did not contradict the future of the crown. Bertie, the second son, carried fear more visibly. His stammer made speech a daily trial, and in a family built on command, hesitation could look like weakness. George could be severe, impatient with vulnerability because he had been trained to fear it in himself. Mary cared, but her care often came wrapped in correction. She believed discipline was protection because discipline had protected her. Her children did not always experience it that way. The abdication crisis did not begin with Wallace Simpson. Wallace gave it a face. The hunger began earlier in rooms where love often arrived as expectation, duty, and improvement. Queen Mary believed duty was love disciplined into shape. Edward learned to suspect that duty was what kept love away. As a boy, and then as Prince of Wales, he discovered that charm could win him warmth faster than obedience ever could. Crowds adored him, women adored him, newspapers adored him. He had the rare gift of seeming intimate with strangers, as if he were looking directly at each person in a crowd. To the public, he was the golden son of Windsor, golden. To his parents, he was becoming the family's most beautiful worry. Bertie moved differently through the same house. Where David glittered, Bertie tightened. He struggled to speak, struggled to please, and carried shame in his body. No child should have to feel that his fear is embarrassing to the crown, yet that is what royal performance can do. Princess Mary, the only daughter, learned the old female inheritance of service, silence, and self-control. Prince John, the youngest, became a private sorrow. His epilepsy and fragile health did not fit the royal portrait of health and continuity. He was loved, but increasingly kept away from the main household at Wood Farm. The arrangement may have been practical and kind. It was also convenient. Royal families often turn pain into privacy, then call privacy protection. When King Edward VII died in 1910, George became King George V, and May became Queen Mary. The title sounded inevitable by then, but inevitability is a story told after the trap is closed. Queen Mary had been the useful poor relation, Eddie's fiancée, George's unexpected bride, mother of heirs, and now queen. The crown had taken almost everything it had asked from her and rewarded her with the grandest role in Britain. She understood the bargain with chilling clarity. She would help turn George's limitations into virtues. His stiffness would become moral seriousness. His plainness would become trustworthiness. His lack of glamour would become national comfort. If monarchy was becoming less magical, it could at least become dependable. The First World War tested that dependability. Britain went to war against Germany while the royal family carried German blood, and the old house name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Anti-German feeling grew fierce. In 1917, George changed the family name to Windsor. The blood did not change, the public label did. That was the genius of the act. It made a German problem sound like an English castle. Mary understood symbols better than almost anyone around her. A name could become a shield. It could draw a line between the British crown and the enemy, however tangled the ancestry beneath. Yet there was a private violence in it. Family history had to be edited in public so the future could survive. The war years made George and Mary more useful to the nation. They visited troops, hospitals, factories, wounded men, anxious families, and ceremonies of endurance. Mary did not gush. She organized, noticed, wrote, and appeared. Her reserve, often mistaken for distance, could become strength in public suffering. In a ward full of pain, a queen who did not collapse could make survival feel dignified. The monarchy survived partly because George and Mary made themselves sober, visible, and British. At the exact moment many other thrones were trembling. The House of Windsor was born from danger. Its public image was steady, domestic, disciplined, and careful. That image helped save the crown. It did not necessarily save every heart inside the family. Little John died in January 1919 after a severe seizure at Wood Farm. He was 13. The public sorrow was quiet. The private wound was deeper than ceremony showed. Mary loved him, but her grief moved through the channels her life allowed: letters, visits, memory, control, and return to duty. The same pattern marked so much of her life. Pain was admitted, arranged, and then required to make room for the next obligation. Her children learned from this, not always in the way she hoped. David learned that duty could swallow tenderness. Bertie learned endurance through fear. Princess Mary learned service. The younger sons learned their own versions of escape and obedience. Queen Mary had not failed because she had no love. She had failed where many royal parents failed. She loved in the only language the institution had taught her fluently. By the 1920s, George and Mary looked like national furniture, solid, familiar, and difficult to remove. Their marriage had become one of the monarchy's great assets. They were not romantic in the public imagination, they were reliable. In uncertain times, reliability can feel like mercy. Yet David, Prince of Wales, became more troubling. He was handsome, stylish, nervous, and adored by crowds. He traveled through the empire, opened buildings, smiled from balconies, and made people feel chosen for a second. But he had no settled wife, no clear appetite for the heavy desk work of kingship, and no patience for the cage waiting for him. His emotional life moved through married women, drawing rooms, and relationships that gave him the warmth he did not find in duty. George saw weakness. Mary saw danger. David wanted affection without sermons. His parents gave him love shaped as preparation. To them, preparing him for kingship was an act of care. To him, it often felt like being weighed and found wanting before breakfast. This was the hidden argument between mother and son. Mary believed sacrifice had given her life meaning. David suspected sacrifice had stolen something essential from her. Neither was entirely wrong. The conflict waited for the woman who would make it impossible to hide. Wallace Simpson entered David's circle in the early 1930s. At first, she did not need to look like a thunderbolt. She was American, married, sharp, stylish, socially alert, and already divorced once. She did not offer David the soft worship many people gave him. She teased him, corrected him, kept him uncertain, and refused to treat him as sacred just because the world did. For a man drowning in deference, contradiction can feel like oxygen. Wallace was not dangerous because she was conventionally beautiful or because she held official power. Her power lay in nerve, timing, and the ability to make David feel emotionally selected rather than institutionally prepared. To Queen Mary, Wallace was dangerous for reasons deeper than nationality, divorce, or manners. Wallace represented the one thing Mary had never been allowed to place first: personal desire. She was not a princess selected by family. She was not a suitable girl polished for duty. She was not a sacrifice made acceptable by ceremony. She was a woman Edward chose because he wanted her. That was what made her intolerable. Wallace did not create the conflict between duty and desire. She exposed it. She stood at the place where the rules Mary had obeyed all her life suddenly looked negotiable in the hands of her son. As David became more dependent on Wallace, George's anxiety sharpened. The king's health was not strong, and worry over his eldest son settled on him like another illness. He feared that after his death, David would damage the throne. Mary contained more than she said. No woman who had lived through royal courts, mistresses, scandals, and family bargains could be naive about affairs. The monarchy had survived discreet sin before, but a king's open dependence on a married, divorced American woman was not discreet sin. It was a constitutional fire with good gloves. A mistress could be hidden by manners. A future queen could not. In 1935, George and Mary celebrated their silver jubilee. The public response moved George deeply. Crowds filled streets, cheered the king and queen, and showed a warmth he had never fully trusted. For Mary, the Jubilee was proof that the Windsor Project had worked. The name change, the discipline, the war service, the domestic image, the steady marriage, the visible endurance, all had produced trust. She and George had become symbols of national continuity, yet the triumph was fragile. David still waited in the future, charming, unresolved, and emotionally attached to Wallace. The crown looked secure because George and Mary stood upright. Behind them, the heir was already leaning away from everything they had built. George died at Sandringham in January 1936. Mary became a widow, and David became King Edward VIII. Her grief had no time to be private. She had lost the husband around whom her adult life had been organized. The man difficult, dutiful, irritable, dependent, and loyal, with whom she had built 4 decades of service. Almost immediately, she had to face the son whose deepest attachment threatened the structure George had died fearing for. Edward, as king, did not become steadier. He became more exposed. Red boxes bored him. Routine irritated him. Wallace remained central. Kingship was not a stage on which to be adored. It was a desk, and the desk kept filling. By then, the crisis was no longer only about whether Edward could marry Wallis Simpson. It was about whether the monarchy would admit that private longing could bend the rules that had bent everyone else. Mary had been bent by those rules. George had been bent by them. Bertie was about to be bent by them. Princess Elizabeth would one day grow beneath them. Edward alone was trying to walk away before they closed around him. He wanted the crown and the woman, the applause and the refuge, the throne and escape from the throne's loneliness. He was not the first person to want incompatible things. He was simply the first modern British king to insist the empire help arrange them. The religious and constitutional problem was real. Edward was head of the Church of England, and Wallis was moving toward divorce from her second husband while her former husbands were still living. The government, the church, and the dominions could not treat the matter as a private romance. Edward imagined compromise. Perhaps Wallis could be his wife without being queen. Perhaps titles could be managed. Perhaps everyone could look troubled for a moment and then agree. But monarchy is built from symbols, and symbols do not enjoy being sliced thin for convenience. To marry the proposal was not only improper, it was an attempt to keep privilege while refusing the sacrifice privilege demanded. Bertie, Duke of York, watched the crisis with dread. He had never wanted the crown. He had built a warmer private life with Elizabeth and their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. His stammer still made public speech a trial. He had been raised near the throne, but not inwardly prepared to desire it. Edward's choice threatened to take that private harbor from him. Elizabeth, his wife, understood the danger. She had married a duke, not a king. She believed in duty, but she knew what kingship would do to her husband. To them, Edward's romance did not look like freedom. It looked like a storm moving toward a nursery. This is the part of the abdication story that often disappears beneath the glamour of love. One man called it love. Several women had to live with the consequences. Queen Mary saw her life of surrender mocked by the son who refused surrender. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon inherited a crown she had not married for. Little Princess Elizabeth moved closer to a future no child could understand. Wallace won the man, but inherited exile, suspicion, and a marriage forever defined by what he'd given up. Even Queen Mary, who seemed hardest, paid as a mother. Edward was not only a constitutional problem. He was David, her firstborn, the baby whose birth had secured her place, the beautiful boy she had never learned how to reach. In December 1936, the crisis broke into the open. Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His brothers witnessed it. The next day he ceased to be king. Bertie became King George VI. Edward then spoke to the nation, saying he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the woman he loved. The line became legend because it sounded intimate and noble. To many listeners, it turned abdication into romance. To Mary, it was abandonment. Her husband had died less than a year earlier, fearing exactly this kind of damage. Now the firstborn son had placed personal longing above the office Mary had spent her life serving. Mary's wound was not simple anger. It was a threat to the meaning of her own life. If Edward had been right to choose love over duty, then what had Mary been rewarded for? If Wallace could be accepted as the woman worth a crown, then what did that make May of Teck, the woman who had surrendered choice for one? To forgive Edward too easily would mean admitting that the rules which consumed her life were not sacred after all. So she did what she had always done. She protected the crown, even when the wound was her own son. Her refusal to receive Wallace was not only snobbery, though snobbery was certainly present. It was self-defense disguised as principle. Edward became Duke of Windsor. Wallis became Duchess of Windsor after their marriage in France in 1937, but she was not granted the style Her Royal Highness. In royal life, titles are not decoration, they are sentences. Denying Wallis that style told the world that she had married the former king, but she had not been accepted as equal within the family he had wounded. Edward resented it. Wallis resented it. Mary did not bend. To welcome Wallis fully would have turned the romance into an acceptable alternative. Mary could not allow that. She had been trained by a world where rank spoke loudly, even when no one raised a voice. The coronation of George VI and Queen Elizabeth took place in May 1937, on the date originally planned for Edward. The ceremony had been prepared for one king and performed for another. Queen Mary attended as the senior widow, watching her second son receive the crown because her first son had walked away. If she felt pride, grief, anger, and fear at once, she would have arranged them internally by precedence. Bertie did not collapse. That was his quiet triumph. He worked, studied, fought his stammer, leaned on Elizabeth, and slowly became the king his brother had refused to be. Mary watched the overlooked son become guardian of everything. Princess Elizabeth, still a child, moved into the line as heir presumptive. The pattern was brutally familiar. Mary had been moved toward George because Eddie died. George had been moved toward the throne because Eddie died. Bertie was moved into kingship because Edward abdicated. Elizabeth was moved closer to destiny because her uncle chose Wallace. The British monarchy survived by asking the unprepared to become inevitable, then praising them for surviving what they had never asked for. Queen Mary knew the pattern too well to miss its cruelty. She had lived it, enforced it, and now watched it repeat in the face of her granddaughter. When she later showed Elizabeth the full respect due to the sovereign, even bowing to the young queen after George VI died, it was not humiliation, it was faith. The person might be young, grieving, and unready. The crown was never treated as a child. Edward's marriage to Wallis in France deepened the wound because it turned private defiance into a permanent household. None of his immediate family attended. For Edward, absence confirmed the coldness he believed had always surrounded him. For Mary, absence was the only dignity left. She could not stand beside a wedding that existed because her son had refused the throne. Yet refusal did not free her from feeling. She followed news of him, read letters, heard complaints, and knew when he was pleading, angry, self-pitying, or lonely. Indifference would have been easier. Love made judgment untidy. The money question made the romance less beautiful. Edward had given up the crown, but he did not want to give up the privileges attached to having been king. Settlements, allowances, jewels, houses, and status became part of the afterlife of abdication. Love had spoken in grand language, but exile still had bills. To Mary, that must have sharpened the offense. Her whole life had taught her that rank existed with obligation. Edward wanted the rank remembered and the obligation forgiven. He wanted the family's recognition without accepting the family's wound. This was not the noble simplicity of a man who had left everything for love. It was messier, smaller, and more human, which made it harder to admire. Wallis also lived with the punishment. She had won the man, but not the family. She could dress perfectly, host brilliantly, and become a figure of style, but she could not force the Windsors to make her royal in the way Edward wanted. That exclusion shaped their marriage. A love story that begins with the sacrifice of a throne does not remain light. The sacrifice enters every room and asks to be acknowledged. Edward had made Wallis the reason he left, which meant she had to live forever beside the cost of his choice. If he felt slighted, she was part of the slight. If he felt exiled, she was the queen of that exile without ever being queen at all. Mary's refusal of Wallis was severe, but severity had been the architecture of her life. She had learned that mercy could endanger structure. She had seen thrones fall in Europe. She had watched the Romanovs perish after hesitation, politics, and fear. She had seen German ancestry become a threat to British loyalty. She had helped edit the family name into Windsor because survival required a cleaner story. To a woman formed by those lessons, Edward's demand for personal happiness looked dangerously indulgent. It was not only that he wanted Wallis, it was that he expected the institution to survive the bending of rules that had held everyone else in place. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor's visit to Germany in 1937 made the wound more political. Edward, resentful and eager for status abroad, allowed himself to be received by a regime Britain increasingly had reason to fear. Wallis stood beside him, elegant and composed, while photographs carried the uncomfortable message that the former king could still be flattered by dangerous company. For George VI and Queen Elizabeth, already laboring to steady the monarchy after abdication, this was more than embarrassing. It was reckless. For Mary, it confirmed her fear that Edward's need to be admired had not ended when he gave up the throne. It had simply moved outside British control. This is why the abdication cannot be treated only as the most romantic decision of a king's life. Romance was the sentence Edward gave the nation. Consequence was the paragraph everyone else had to read. Bertie had to become king before he felt strong enough. Elizabeth had to become queen beside a husband who feared public speech. Their daughters had to grow beneath a future suddenly closer than childhood should allow. Mary had to defend a son she pitied from a son she could not forgive. Wallis had to live as the woman blamed for a constitutional crisis, even when Edward's weakness was his own. The crown survived, but survival redistributed pain through the family. For Queen Elizabeth, the new role demanded a transformation of her own. She had not married Bertie expecting to become queen. She had resisted the royal family more than once before accepting him, aware that love inside the monarchy was never simply private. After the abdication, her warmth became public armor. She smiled where Mary stood still. She charmed where Mary corrected. She made Bertie feel less alone in a role that could have crushed him. In doing so, she offered the public another model of queenship, one softer than Mary's, but no less useful. Mary could admire that warmth and still feel the comparison. The younger queen reached people in a language Mary had never been taught to speak. Princess Elizabeth also became part of Mary's late life lesson. The child was serious, observant, and already trained by circumstance to listen more than she spoke. Mary recognized the look. It was the face of a girl around whom adults had begun arranging the future. Elizabeth did not choose that future any more than May had chosen the chain of events that moved her toward George. The difference was that Elizabeth was being prepared in a more modern family with a more visible affection and less Victorian silence. Yet the central demand remained unchanged. Wanting was optional. Accepting was not. Mary saw in Elizabeth both reassurance and repetition. During the war, this repetition became heroic in public and painful in private. George VI found a role through endurance. Queen Elizabeth turned presence into courage. The princesses became symbols of the future. And Mary watched from the position of elder witness, proud and wary. The family had been damaged by Edward, but war gave it another chance to prove usefulness. Bombs over London did what no press office could do. They made the monarchy share the nation's danger, not equally, but visibly. The king and queen stayed. They visited ruins. They carried fear into public service. Edward, by contrast, was moved to the Bahamas, given a post grand enough to look useful and distant enough to be safe. The contrast could not have been lost on Mary. The son who had left duty had to be contained. The son who had accepted duty had to be strengthened. One lived abroad with the woman he had chosen and complained of slights. The other stood under the pressure of war and spoke to the country through a voice that did not come easily. If Mary ever doubted the cruelty of duty, the war gave her no simple answer. Duty hurt Bertie, but it made him necessary. Edward's freedom spared him the throne, but left him diminished. Wallace gave him private devotion, but not public purpose. The crown took much from those who served it, yet it also gave their suffering shape. In her final years, Mary became more than a widow. She became the keeper of the argument. Around her stood the evidence. Edward in exile, Bertie on the throne, Elizabeth in preparation, Wallace outside the gates, the monarchy remade as Windsor, and her own life polished into an example younger royals were expected to study. She had preserved the crown so thoroughly that even its wounds were treated as lessons. The danger was that lessons can harden. A woman who survives by silence may teach silence as virtue. A family that survives by duty may mistake duty for love. Mary's greatness and limitation came from the same source. She knew how to keep the structure standing. She did not always know how to keep the people inside it warm. That is what makes the story powerful for women watching now. It is not only about palaces or titles, it is about the old bargain offered to women in many polished forms. Be useful. Be composed. Do not embarrass the family. Accept what must be accepted. Turn pain into service. Then watch history call you strong without asking whether strength was the only room left unlocked. Queen Mary lived that bargain at the highest level. Wallace broke into it from the outside. Edward tried to escape it from the inside. Bertie and Elizabeth paid to repair it. Princess Elizabeth inherited the repaired version. The crown continued, but the question remained under the jewels. Who gets praised for surrendering, and who gets condemned for refusing? Edward and Wallace lived abroad under the polished discomfort of exile. Their love had conquered a throne, but it did not conquer consequence. Edward wanted recognition, money, status for Wallace, and signs that the family might soften. Wallace had gained the man and inherited the grievance. To be loved by someone who has given up a crown sounds grand until every breakfast contains the unspoken reminder. Mary did not need to make Wallace into a monster. She only needed to keep her outside. Exclusion in royal life rarely shouts. It arrives through absent invitations, missing styles, unanswered warmth, and doors that remain beautifully closed. The Second World War deepened the contrast. George VI, the reluctant king, stayed in Britain with Queen Elizabeth as bombs fell. His broadcasts were difficult because of his speech, and that difficulty made them powerful. He was not a natural performer tossing phrases into the air. He was a frightened man forcing duty through fear. The country could feel it. Queen Elizabeth stood beside him with warmth and courage. Princess Elizabeth grew into seriousness. The monarchy repaired itself around the very people Edward's decision had forced forward. The son who accepted duty became beloved and worn down by it. The son who rejected duty lived in luxury, complaint, and distance. A mother could not have missed that cruel contrast, even if a queen would never say it so bluntly. Queen Mary lived long enough to see the cost of both choices. Edward escaped the throne and never escaped resentment. Bertie accepted the throne and spent himself in service. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became queen because another woman had been forbidden to be one. Princess Elizabeth became the future because her uncle had stepped away. Mary herself became a living monument, admired for discipline, remembered in diamonds, feared for her standards, and still carrying the girl who had once learned that royal blood without security could be a precarious gift. She had preserved jewels, names, objects, traditions, and the crown itself with both hands. Preserving was how she fought disappearance, but the same instinct that saved the monarchy made tenderness harder to reach. When George VI died in 1952, Princess Elizabeth became queen while away in Kenya. Once again, the crown moved through shock and asked a young person to become inevitable. Queen Mary was old, frail, and still mentally sharp. She respected the new sovereign at once. The gesture mattered because it told the family that personal age, grief, and seniority did not outrank the office. She hoped to see Elizabeth's coronation, but died in March 1953, only weeks before the ceremony. Before her death, she made clear that the coronation should not be postponed. It was the perfect final instruction from a woman who had spent her life placing ceremony beyond personal interruption. That is why Queen Mary's story cannot be reduced to coldness. She was not destroyed by scandal. She was consumed by usefulness. The crown did not punish her. It rewarded her for disappearing into duty so completely that later generations mistook the disappearance for virtue. She helped save the monarchy through war, renaming discipline, family image, and sheer endurance. She also helped build a household where several children searched for warmth in dangerous places. Edward's abdication did not come from nowhere. It grew from his weakness, vanity, dependence, and hunger, but also from a family culture where duty and love were too often treated as rivals. Bertie's courage did not come from nowhere either. It grew from fear, correction, loyalty, Elizabeth's warmth, and the brutal necessity Edward left behind. Queen Mary rejected Edward and Wallace not simply because they broke royal rules. She rejected them because they exposed the cost of every rule she had obeyed. Wallis was not merely an American divorcee in royal eyes. She was proof that a person might choose desire over the crown and survive, even if survival came with exile. Edward was not merely a romantic king. He was the son who made his mother's lifelong surrender look less like destiny and more like a bargain she had never been free to refuse. That is the wound beneath the abdication. Not only a king leaving a throne, a mother watching her child refuse the sacrifice she had spent a lifetime making sacred. In the official portrait, Queen Mary stands upright, glittering, unsmiling, almost carved from the same material as the jewels she preserved. The image is not false, it is incomplete. Behind the diamonds was May of Teck, the girl who learned that dependence was never free. Behind the stern mother was a woman who believed discipline had saved her and could not understand why it did not save everyone else the same way. Behind the queen who would not receive Wallis was the bride, once moved by dynasty from one future to another. Edward gave up the crown for Wallis. Mary had given up choice for duty. Between those two acts lay the history of a family, a monarchy, and several women forced to live with decisions men called necessary, romantic, or noble. By the time Mary neared the end of her life, the question had not softened. It had only changed faces. Eddie, George, Edward, Bertie, Elizabeth, Wallis all stood inside the same long argument between private want and public duty. Mary had chosen, or had been taught to choose, the side that kept the crown standing. Edward chose the side that let him breathe. Neither answer was clean. One preserved the institution, the other exposed its human price. That is why her story still unsettles royal history. It does not ask whether the system failed. It asks what kind of woman had to be built so carefully that the system could call itself successful while quietly taking almost everything from her and then praise the result itself. The final sadness is not that Queen Mary failed the system. She proved how well it could work. She became useful, steady, disciplined, and almost impossible to bend. She gave Britain stability. She gave Windsor a future. She watched one son abandon the throne, another son carry it, and a granddaughter inherit it. She did everything expected of her, and that was both her triumph and her wound. When a woman is rewarded for surrendering herself completely, history often calls it devotion because it cannot bear to call it loneliness. Queen Mary never asked that question in public. She would have found it undignified. But the silence around her marriage, her motherhood, and her rejection of Edward, and Wallis tells its own story. Mary obeyed the rules because she had been taught they were sacred. Edward broke them because he believed love made them cruel. Wallis did not create that conflict. She exposed it.